I'm going to talk about an introductory overview to clinical trials and why they're important to us. And I used to, in the previous life, look after the NCRI, the National Cancer Research Institute Consumer Forum, which was a group of patient advocates from all over the UK and all cancer sites, and we provided training to each of them. So we would give them a high level of what trials were, because they were obviously experts in their own cancers, but may not know the wider landscape. So it's taken from there. I am acutely aware that in the room today are people with a lot more knowledge than me, so I've already asked Rob not to heckle me. I'm going to do a brief overview, and then I know that he's going to pick up on some of the points that I'm going to make. So, first of all, why do we need them? Well, if you look on the right, this was an advert in the paper in the early 1900s. And the healer would apply cancer paste or carbolic ointment to the external affected areas, and this caused excruciating pain. But of course, people didn't know any better, and there was no evidence to say yes or no. And all of this, and all of these snake oil salesmen that we hear spreading, rubbish about things being effective when they're not, needed to be regulated. These needed to be brought in line. And in the UK, that was the 1939 Cancer Act, and no person shall take part in the publication of any advertisement containing an offer to treat any person with cancer, to prescribe any remedy, or give any advice in connection with the treatment thereof. And recently, there's actually been quite a lot of discussion around whether this act is still fit for purpose. And I think in the world of modern medicine, it's a good chance to have another look at it. But the cut and thrust of it all is that the practice of medicine needs to be based in evidence. And to get that evidence, we need a trial. We need to prove that something works better than nothing, or better than something else. So that's why we need them. So we still can't cure everybody, as this room will be acutely aware. Some things work in some people, some things don't. And for rarer cancers, we have few, if any, treatment options. And I'm mainly thinking now about drug trials, because obviously, as we've discussed at great length today, surgery is a treatment, very effective and can be very curative treatment option. I'm mainly thinking about drug trials here. What happens in the laboratory doesn't always happen in real life. So if you think again how different we all are, we all have different reactions to different things. And I think that when we think about drug trials again, the example I always use is that if you test something in a lab or on an animal, the toxicity, so how the person can tolerate that treatment, needs to be looked at in a human. So this is the reality of drug development. It takes place in animals. And if you look at nicotine, for example, the level at which an animal will become toxic and feel unwell is completely different to a human. Humans actually experience toxicity much quicker. So we are different, and we need trials to check that what we think might work is actually not going to, be very unwell for humans. So in cancer research, we find smaller improvements from newer treatments, which is good, not necessarily in salivaries yet. And we may have a few weeks more survival as an outcome. There are more survivors living with or beyond cancer, and we talked about that earlier today, which means we need more studies in late effects, recurrence, and multiple morbidities. And then, of course, there's the psychosocial aspects, palliative care, screening, diagnostics, new technologies, and they all need an evidence base. Now, I don't want to invite a correction, but in surgery there's the trans-oral robotic surgery tools, and there's quite a lot of publications around how brilliant they are. I don't think that's necessarily agreed on by all surgeons, if you want to. Similarly, if we look at new technology such as proton beams, there is lots of evidence that they are very effective in head and neck cancer and children's cancer, brain cancers. They became the standard of care for prostate cancer in the US when there's no evidence of efficacy for prostate cancer. We need evidence, and we have to do the hard yards to get it. It's not new, this is not a new idea. On the right, you will see James Lind in 1747 on board the HMS Salisbury. So he is a legend for carrying out the first ever controlled trials. So he had this whole ship full of very ill seamen. So he took 12 men who all had scurvy, divided them into 6 pairs and treated them with various different remedies, back to the what we think might work point. Some had the cider, which probably was an immediate relief, if not the next day. Some had vitriol, some had seawater. Some had this array of nutmeg and other things. Some had vinegar, and some had 2 oranges and a lemon. Guess what? By the end of the week, those on the citrus fruits were well enough to nurse the others. And I do recall reading somewhere that apparently even the sailors that ate the rats that ate the lemons were better, or some form of, yeah. So anyway, so there you go. So this isn't a new thing. Why am I telling you about all of this? So, because I think, and hopefully we're going to hear a little bit later from Rob as well, that this is a really positive time for rare cancers and hopefully for salivary cancers. So what is ongoing at the moment? So, I mean, there's this massive focus on early detection, and we know the challenges in salivary cancers. They're not hard to find, there's no risk profile. Who do you screen, even if you could screen? So they're not necessarily all applicable for us. There are these new treatments, there are the living with and beyond, and the patient needs, I'd just like to say while we're here, are being addressed in research in our research working group. So our charity research working group are looking at a number of related things. So I've got a few slides and I'm talking quite a lot, so I'm going to whistle through these a bit more quickly. As I touched on earlier, and you can ask Rob more about these, is that before we come to humans, we test in the laboratory and we test in animals, and that can help us understand side effects, toxicity levels, and what might happen in the body. I always find it quite extraordinary that when you look at the side effects of a trial drug, you know, like sort of spots in the middle of hands, or you know, really bizarre skin pigmentation changes that you don't necessarily think of in a disease which any of us would have experienced. I find that really quite interesting. So there are basically, rule of thumb, 4 phases for trials. So the phase 1 is the first in humans that I've been talking about. And quite often it's those of us that are really rather unwell that go into these trials. You know, we pretty much might know that, you know, our time is limited, and we want to help others. And that's why many patients go into it. These trials have small numbers. But even if you don't benefit from that drug, you know that the information that others get from that drug will be beneficial overall, and that's the reason many people do it. I think phase 2 is where, you know, you've worked out that the drug is, you know, it's okay, it seems safe, it you know, it could be a good thing, but is it actually doing anything? And is it doing enough without making the patient feel absolutely rotten, even more rotten? And there you would have sort of traditionally larger numbers of patients. And then the phase 3, and there has never been a phase 3 trial in the salivary cancer, just saying. And this is where you look amongst larger populations. Is it better or worse than the current standard of patients living longer? And then phase 4, well, that's really lovely, isn't it? That's when you're looking at sort of COVID vaccines and stuff, and large populations of people. So one of the key concepts to all of this is randomization, the idea being that you tell the difference between whether it's working or not by giving it to some people and not giving it to other people and seeing what happens. Now, in rare cancers, there are a lot of ethical questions about randomization. Not the concept of randomization, but can you have a control arm where you don't do anything? Because there aren't many of us. So there are more and more clever ways to think about how you can still get the same effect. So you might use real world data, like from the biobank at the Christie, just saying, Or you might, maybe, if you're a forward-thinking regulator, use some evidence from another country in a trial or another trial. So there are lots of clever ways that you can do this without having to take patients in danger. And where are these drugs coming from? Well, luck, serendipity. They could be plant or marine toxins. They could be older drugs, or there could be an argument, maybe based on genomic profile or other cancers, which leads you to think that that drug might work. So I talked a couple of weeks ago at a conference about adaptive trial design, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview that all these things that we talk about in salivary cancers is how few there are of us, how poorly they are understood, and there isn't all this investment in understanding them better. But increasingly, cancer treatment is becoming much more precision-based and biomarker-driven. So the MIV mutation for ACC, HER2 in salivary duct, trackers. There are whole charities and patient groups springing up related to a specific genomic mutation. So the way cancer treatment is thought about is changing. And these traditional designs can be quite inflexible, and they take quite a long time. Some of these trials go on for years. We haven't got years. We've got weeks sometimes. So we need to be quicker and thinking better and using patients best. And if something's not working, get that patient off that arm, move them onto the arm that is working. And there are many trialists now that think that way. And I'm not going to talk through this in detail, but basically these are basket trials, umbrella trials, and platform trials, and these are all the adaptive trial designs that I've been talking about. So, the example of the platform trial that we have in the UK, and I presented this 2 years ago, and it was still the only example. There's a couple of others I found, but this is for salivary patients. So if you have a HER2 amplification, you can go currently onto arm 4. So it has a number of different arms. It's been run by CI UK with funding as well from the government. And it's been running for a few years now. But it's specifically for already licensed drugs. So they are testing in arm 4, I think it's trastuzumab, which is already licensed for different cancers. But if you have a HER2 amplification mutation, you can go in and have that drug tested to see if it works on you. And we were asked as a charity directly by CI UK to put this out there, and Rob and I talk about it whenever we're talking about with other clinicians. And I know that through our messaging, patients have been referred into the trial, which is amazing. We need more trials like this. We need them in the UK, and we need them now, just saying. So, last thing I'm going to say is, because I want to end on a positive note, and it leads into what Rob's going to say, but we haven't had a UK breast cancer spill before. We had an MP who opened our Salivary Gland Cancer Awareness Day in Manchester, open our day. He spoke about losing his brother to a cystic cell carcinoma in the House of Commons. We heard Lord Patel speak for us in the House of Lords when it was debated at the Lords. This bill is in law now, so it doesn't matter who's in charge in the government, this bill is there, and it is specifically to do a few things around expanding trial access, having someone responsible in government for actually doing this, and it also has stipulation around data sharing and around databases.